Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Social Work to Wealth podcast. Taylor here with Faith, and we are going to be chatting today about burnout recovery. That's the topic. I feel like just a conversation that we are continually talking about in our profession, grad school. And so we have Shaina Siber here to talk with us and share all of her wonderful knowledge and wisdom about burnout recovery and her experience with, supporting people through burnout. So, yeah, thanks, Shaina, for joining us.
Yeah, so happy to be here, Taylor Faye. Thanks for having me.
So tell us who you are, what you do, like how did you get into this work?
Sure. I'm Shaina Siber. I use pronouns she, hers. I'm a Pisces. No, I'm
Yes.
yes. Well, it's interesting because we're going into burnout recovery discussions, and it's something that is so common, especially here in the United States, is that when we ask each other, like, who are you? What do you do? Oftentimes we kind of lead with our professional identity.
Totally.
And that is, so much of, I think, what is at the root of some of our burnout. But I
Ooh,
digress.
interesting.
Yeah. But I'm a LCSW. I'm an integrative therapist. I'm the owner and founder of Affirm Mental Health, which is an accredited CE program. I'm the host of the Affirming Minds podcast, which is a CE eligible podcast for therapists. And I'm the author of the book, Using ACT and CFT for Burnout Recovery. So I live in Arizona now, but my sort of work history, the 15 years before that, I lived and worked in the Bronx in New York in community mental health and hospital-based settings in various clinical and leadership roles. And that is sort of what brought me into this burnout space is, COVID was a bitch, I think, for, all of us. Obviously, it was affected everybody. I think kind of like what I always thought was the most helpful metaphor I heard was that we were all in the same storm, but everybody was in different boats. Some people were in
Mm.
yachts, some people were, on like a piece of wood just paddling in the water. And
So, I love that
I just
analogy.
seriously got
Wow.
chills. Oh my
Yeah.
gosh, because yeah, I was in the hospitals on a felt like
A
swimming
raft.
swimming
yeah,
drowning.
yeah.
I didn't even have anything to keep me afloat.
Right, exactly. Some people just out there in the water, no life jacket. And I think,
Mm.
the Bronx was really emblematic of that because prior to COVID, the Bronx is like amazing in so many ways, home of the Yankees, birthplace of hip hop, so much incredible like art, music, culture, but also so much systemic inequity. And, when you sort of position that all of the systemic racism and inequity that the environmental injustice the Bronx has experienced over many, many decades. The intersection of that of just what was happening in healthcare and our hospital was overloaded, and we disproportionately experienced deaths in the community for it was so many reasons that too long to enumerate at this time. But the healthcare impact on the workers, obviously they were vulnerable to getting COVID
Mm.
themselves, and we did lose members of our hospital team in the process. But it was just like burnout was pervasive. It would be weird if you weren't burnt out at that point.
Uh-huh.
And the Department of
Mm.
Psychiatry, I was in a director role at the time, we sort of mobilized to create a crisis response for healthcare workers in our hospital system to get them sort of the psychological first aid and then the treatment that they need. Because we know as therapists, it can be so hard to get connected to treatment. And we needed to get people in quick because people were struggling so significantly from burnout, but also from moral injury was really significant. And then some people had no formal behavioral health histories, but some people came in and already were struggling maybe with trauma histories, depression, anxiety, and this just was like, fuel on the fire for them. So
Mm.
doing that work, that became like sort of my private practice at that time. I was seeing healthcare workers exclusively. And then I was, rapidly burning out at the time. So there was this parallel process where I was, like trying to show up for my clients in effective ways while completely, neglecting myself and like being at the mercy of my burnout until sort of a moment of collapse. So that's sort of been my focus for the last several years is one, as an embodied practice as a therapist, what do I need to do to be sustainable, and do this for years to come? I'm lucky. I happen to really love being a therapist. I love doing this work. I love being a social worker, and I want to do it for a long time. And that I have to be really intentional about how I show up and how I practice and how live my life to do that. But also kind of looking at like what was working for my patients. And I was, people were getting better and there were positive impacts that were happening. So I've really been working on like formalizing the process so that can be duplicated. About like what are the things that are working to address burnout recovery, particularly when the systems aren't necessarily changing immediately. So sorry, that was a long-winded answer. I tend to
Yeah.
do that, but
Yes. Well, that's why we have you here, so you
yeah.
can talk to us
Yes.
and teach us. Um, yeah, I think lots of things I want to point out that you mentioned, but I think just in terms of Faith and I, before this conversation, just we recognize, I'm sure listeners know, it's like, well, the burnout, it's not my fault that these systems and, that are not set up to support us, you know? And I saw this phrase recently in a newsletter where someone said, everyone will thrive when properly supported. And like thriving can mean different things to different people, but I just want us to kind of frame this conversation today around like this is about us, kind of practical ways for us to take care of ourselves, because yes, there are systematic issues that that are just may take some time for us to really like change and impact the way that we, are able to do this work. So I feel like that's where our conversation
Mhm.
will be focused on today, but I just want to acknowledge that there are larger systems at play that really, impact um this issue too. Um
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
mentioned, do you want to say something, Faith?
No, just to piggyback on that, I think a lot of times today it's like, well, what's really going to help me not have burnout is if you change the system that's causing the burnout, right?
Right.
And that is very true and that needs to be addressed. And I think Taylor and I really believe that needs to be addressed. But there are people suffering now who are living and working in these systems. And so, what can we do now to manage burnout? And also, there will be, and hopefully in time, changes in the systems that create burnout, even within the social work profession, right? But the conversation today is about how to manage current burnout. How do you survive now, today? And maybe those things aren't going to address the system changes, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
more
Yeah.
about what can you do now to address burnout currently in your life. Does that feel?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah. Well,
that's
I
what we're.
I I couldn't agree with both of you more, and I do want to name explicitly, you know, a lot of the therapeutic approaches that I use are contextually based, which means like we have to start with by acknowledging the systems we're in, and I think
Mhm.
both of you are right that what do we do when the systems are making us sick, right? And what are that and that a lot of the way I position burnout is it is a natural outcome. It's the expected outcome when we have bodies and minds that are under chronic occupational stress that is not sustainable.
Mm.
Part of this
Beautiful.
work is well how we, I sort of was like getting the ick about this word resilience that comes up so much in burnout, like in burnout literature. I was like, I
Yes.
don't want to be resilient. How much resilient do I have to be? That the work of
Mhm.
acceptance is so tricky because it's not about accepting unworkable systems like
Mm-hmm.
racism, xenophobia,
Yeah.
sexism, um, toxic capitalistic systems that don't see our humanity and sort of see our value only in our output. But part of this work of burnout recovery is not to accommodate the system. I would say that's like much more what happens in burnout when we're overworking and we're people pleasing and we're subjugating our own needs. Part of this is being well enough for resistance, individual
Ooh.
resistance, collective resistance. So that is also the work of burnout recovery is, yes, there is a resilience piece. There is a restoration piece, right, which is really critical. But there is a resistance. And I think that is something that we really kind of need to have centered in burnout
Mm.
discussions.
I love
Love it.
that because I think the resistance piece, I've shared a little bit about this before of just in one of my previous workplaces in a hospital, we were trying to collectively, unionize and just
Mhm.
advocate for more pay for social workers. And one thing that I noticed after leaving that was that part is so exhausting, kind of going through it. But I think you just kind of bringing that into this realm of burnout recovery, I think it was just we had the energy for it
Mhm.
and we
Mm.
don't always.
Yeah.
So
Mm.
that's interesting. Can you share kind of what are some burnout signs, symptoms, things that might signal that someone's experiencing burnout?
Yeah, absolutely. So you named one, right? Exhaustion. We are tired, right? So very tired.
Mm.
And I think that kind of like deep mental fatigue, physical fatigue is certainly a warning sign, not always, but certainly for many, many people, they recognize fatigue and exhaustion. Um, Mental distance, so sort of for some people, it shows up as sort of a detachment and a cynicism and a disengagement. Um, for other folks, it's cognitive impairment. So they're having difficulty concentrating, they're forgetful, they're having memory issues. Something I see a lot is uh, a reduced decision-making capacity. So, like, they've sort of like, I'm at, like, decision fatigue. I can't do one more thing. I can't make one more decision. That's why, like, some of these, like, burnout and wellness webinars are so infuriating because it's like, you want me to do yoga? I can't do one more thing. I can't add one more thing or make one
Mm.
more decision. And then I think, emotional reactivity and sensitivity, overwhelm, and sort of difficulty regulating emotions. So, maybe if you find yourself snapping, shutting down, more tearful, things like that are something we see. Also, there's secondary symptoms of burnout. So, it can cause or exacerbates psychosomatic complaints, so headaches, muscle tension, GI distress, sleep disruptions, frequent illness or lowered immunity is something I see. I work with a lot of people with autoimmune conditions, and like they have to safeguard their, sort of um, their work experiences so carefully because it can have such significant health impacts, and it can exacerbate pre-existing mental health conditions or be a precursor to depression and anxiety and things like that. One thing I do want to mention is oftentimes when we talk about burnout and sort of in some of like classic definitions, we talk about reduced personal efficiency. So basically coded language from you become less productive. And
Mm.
while that technically is something that can happen, when you have cognitive impairment and emotional dysregulation and you're tired, I don't like talking about it as a burnout indicator specifically because I think that who's often missed from the burnout conversation is high performers and people who actually produce the most. High achievers, leaders, the go-to person, right? Like the person who's like, they
Mm.
are punished by being so good at their work that they get more work. Those
Mhm.
Yeah.
folks are
Mhm.
often the people that are suffering the most and the most burnt out, and they may never have obvious performance decline. And I think this is so important because I work with so many residents, fellows, and physicians. They have amongst the highest rate of completed suicides. And oftentimes what we find is like they work, they work, they work, they work. There is no decline in productivity. And they're suffering silently, and we miss them, and we don't reach them until it's too late. So,
Yeah, because
um,
that's because we're looking for that decrease in the performance output and it's never really there, but we should be
Mm.
looking at
exactly.
yeah, okay, interesting. You mentioned earlier moral injury. Can you talk a little bit about that? Define that for us?
Sure. So, moral injury was initially talked about in military contexts, sort of this idea that people were showing up oftentimes looking at like people on the front lines and people in combat roles when they were asked to perform missions or tasks that went against their deeply held moral values. And this has been increasingly used in the literature and something that we're seeing across professional domains. So we see this in healthcare. COVID was something where this rose a lot because there was such rapid change to the healthcare system and people didn't have a lot of information and we're just overloaded and we're doing the best they can with limited resources. And a lot of people didn't like what they were asked to do. They didn't like how the care was being disseminated at the time. Healthcare, I think anyone working in healthcare and therapists, like we talk a lot about like working within systems that feel very broken, and the ethical and moral dilemmas that show up. We see this in political spaces where people are resigning, right? Because they are being asked to do things that feel, in contrast with their deeply held values. So, moral injury is the sort of psychological and emotional fallout when we feel complicit, either by participating or witnessing in a professional context, doing things that go against um, our integrity and
Mm.
our highly regarded personal values.
Mm. Thank you for defining that. I've yeah, I could
I
see that being true for social workers. And Taylor, even
absolutely.
in the profession that you're in with organ procurement, right? Like you've talked a little bit about this,
Yeah, what's interesting
actually.
yeah, there was
Yeah,
I mean, I'm not gonna get into the details, but there have
right.
been times where it has felt like that, and my husband recently kind of used that language, and I was like, "Whoa, that totally is what it feels like," and I recently saw that that
Mm,
was added to the DSM.
Yeah, yeah. So
mm.
it's added as a Z code, which I think is really important, so people can start identifying it. Because for folks who are exposed to situations that can cause moral injury, we're finding that it has um, symptoms that can be similar to post traumatic stress disorder.
That's what I was wondering. Yeah, makes that guilt and shame, something that you have to participate in that goes against your values yeah, for your job. Makes so much sense. Wow, fascinating. Um, can you talk a little bit more about what are some systemic or environmental factors that impact burnout that you've seen?
Right. Yeah. So I want
Yeah.
to I'll start by like my very, very social work way, zooming way out, like kind of
Mhm.
to the macro. So I
Yeah.
would say we have to have conversations about burnout in the context of capitalism and consumerism. So I think kind of just understanding how burnout shows up in the United States in particular is often grounded in this idea that um we are our work, right? Like that our work is supposed to be tied to our professional identity, that if we want the American dream, if we want to be acceptable members of society, then we will work sufficiently and contribute sufficiently to our work, and we will be rewarded with a house and a white picket fence, 2.5 kids, and a golden retriever, right? And I think that's already a lot of people have been eliminated from that system and
Mhm.
for
Mhm.
the history of the United States, and it's nothing new for many people who've been marginalized in our society. But I think increasingly across the board, even people who have historically held privilege are kind of seeing that as not realistic. But these are very internalized messages we get our whole lives. So when you aren't able to have that and your work is not outputting to these things that we feel like the good American citizen has, a lot of personal blame happens, a lot of systemic blames happens, like we shame people for not being able to buy homes or for living in poverty or living paycheck to paycheck rather than zooming out and looking at these bigger things. And then alongside that, consumerism, which like sort of exists along capitalism, that says these are the things beyond our sufficiency, the things we need to live and survive. This is what you need to have to be acceptable, to be attractive, to be happy, right? And a lot of the things that we think about when we think about money and resources are tied to the things that we think we need to have, right? We need to have enough money to have these things. And they're not always tied to our own personal values. Sometimes these are sort of broader societal messages of like what we need to have to be acceptable. So that's sort of like the big broad strokes thing. And I'm not an economic scholar and I'm not anti-capitalist, which I think I could, but I think we just sort of
Yeah.
talk in like the broader context of how these things show up in our lives so we can have the awareness to name them and see how they influence our sense of self and our behaviors. I think on a
Mhm.
more meso level we look at how is those capitalistic ideals enacted. Unrealistic workload and productivity pressures are a lot of them, right? I think we
Uh-huh.
see that all the time. We see a lack of autonomy or control as being a big systemic contributor to burnout, bureaucracy that can happen, documentation burdens. I'm talking a little bit specifically about, maybe healthcare workers and therapists and things like that. Um, Lack of recognition and reward. So reward certainly being like being appreciated, being validated, showing that your work is important. But I don't think we talk about money enough when we talk about burnout. When people
Mhm.
are not adequately compensated for their work, right, that is going to be an incredible fuel for increased burnout because it's going to lead so intensely to stress. And I talk a lot about in my work threat activation and sort of like how our sense of survival gets sort of entangled in our work and experience. And some of that is sort of a misfiring of our tricky brain, is that we are misinterpreting sort of a critical email or like our boss being rude as a crisis, and our body kind of responds in kind, goes into fight or flight. But some of it is very real, right? That like for a lot of us, if we lose our job, well, we don't pay our rent or have great ways of feeding ourselves or clothing our children or things like that. So that
Or don't
that
have health care.
or don't have health
Don't have
care,
health
right?
care.
Right.
Right.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Um, and unfairness is another one. So
Mhm.
unfortunately, that happens in a lot of ways, like lack of fairness, lack of transparency in work environments. That can happen very much across the board. But I do think I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about how pervasive, unfortunately, still is that discrimination and harassment happen,
Yeah.
particularly around things like race, gender, um, people in different body sizes, folks that
Mhm.
are living with chronic disability, neurodivergence. Those things are happening every day at workplaces and certainly make people more at risk at burnout from a more of a systemic level.
Mhm.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you for like talking through all those different aspects of it. And one thing that comes to mind when you mention pay is something that we talk about a lot with social work to wealth is like the pay piece of social workers are told, like you're not in it for the money, but then you're doing this really, really intense emotional labor in the work that you're doing. And to feel like maybe I do want to make a little more almost feels bad internally, like shameful. And so there's like this interesting, complex feeling of like, I feel like I should be paid more, but then
Mhm.
I feel bad for even asking for more, which then contributes to that like shame piece that you were talking about. So I appreciate you mentioning that. And then all the different layers as well. Taylor,
Yeah.
did you have something you
Yeah.
wanted to add? Yeah.
I mean, I was gonna bring up the pay thing too because that's
Yeah.
that's that's what we're about here, and
Yeah.
just like
Yeah.
and just trying to just recognizing and calling out that the financial wellness piece, the pay piece
Hmm.
is such a huge it's so impactful in our lives and the burnout self-care conversations that we've historically had and have heard
Mm.
have left out that finance piece and it
Hmm.
just feels it's just like, how? I feel like it's such a big piece of the pie of what
Hmm.
makes it to where I can live a life that I feel just well, you
Right.
know?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Right.
just yeah,
Right.
appreciate you bringing that up.
And I think you
Hmm.
hit the nail on the head too of like, what does it mean for me to live well? And you
Yeah.
and I may have different uh operational definitions of wellness. And that's why I kind of bring up that consumerism piece is like consumerism that feeds us like this is what everybody needs to be well and
Right.
acceptable and right
Right.
versus how much money that's a question I ask in my book is like how much money do you need to be resourced to meet your needs,
Mm.
but then to live your values, to live a life that feels important to you, where, seeing money as a conduit to this is a way, this is how we function in our society. It's a energetic exchange for most of what we'll do and experience in our life. So if we can't have a relationship with money that is connected to things that are meaningful to us and we reject it as a whole because we've been fed that like money is evil and we're not supposed to want it if we care about people. Again, I think we're like keeping the power away from the people that we would hope actually can participate most, right? Like that it is in some of these conversations. And I always get curious about why that is. Why is it that social workers, nurses, childcare providers,
Teachers.
teachers,
Teachers. I was thinking
right?
teachers. Yeah.
The people that maybe have some of the most impactful investment in our society are compensated the least and sort of seeing that as like a badge of honor. And I think,
Women
we're
dominated professions.
Yeah.
absolutely. So, yeah,
Yeah.
I agree with you. It needs to be talked about more in the conversation.
Yeah.
Amazing. What do you think are some individual factors that contribute to burnout? Like more looking at the individual, you did macro, mesio, but like what could be individual, you know, dynamics that could contribute to burnout?
Yeah, so I would say, everybody listening and look inward. Are you, like people pleasing, is a big
Mhm.
component. Perfectionism, um, and a high level of empathy for others, paired with like taking other responsibility for other people's emotions.
Mm.
A lot of folks that I
Beautifully
work
said.
with, yeah, feel like they feel responsible for regulating other people, and that can
Hmm.
be incredibly stressful on top of everything you're doing. People that have a difficulty with boundaries, communicating boundaries, enforcing boundaries. And then something that I refer to as social rank sensitivity. Simply put, that tied to our survival, like as mammals, we are very sensitive to our social rank, right? And we and status and things like that. Like it does on a survival level equal what we have access to in terms of resources, sometimes in terms of partners, like who we're mating with, in this very way where we can't separate ourselves just from our, animal natures. But I think in our day-to-day modern society, when we treat every potential dip in status as a crisis risk, as a survival risk, we put ourselves into an activated state that is not helpful and is deeply stressful long term on our nervous system. So the way that I see this often functioning in work settings is people that are looking a lot for external validation, looking for other people to tell them that they're doing okay, that they're acceptable, right? That they are it's harder to generate that internally, to recognize their strengths, their contributions, their competence, they don't believe it unless it's coming from the outside, and that validation is like needs to be coming chronically. I think those folks are incredibly high risk for burnout.
Yeah, and the piece about kind of taking on, these emotions and feeling responsible. I'm curious. I feel like a lot of people in our work feel like they would identify themselves as like an empath, and I think that's kind of part of. I mean, on one hand, they're like that's a um they're proud of that, right? It's like I can really sense other people's emotions, but it seems like there might be kind of like a line where it could start to get a little bit just become negative, self-negative, I
Yeah, yeah,
guess.
yeah, yeah.
Um
It is hard
yeah.
to differentiate like being compassionate and
Mm,
caring deeply about other people from like a place of or what you value and what you care about, from what I see largely as a fawning response. So kind of going back to that process of like we kind of go into these threat responses, so fight, flight, fawn, flop, freeze in our work settings. I think you can map burnout directly onto those, survival responses. A lot of folks, a lot of people in helping professions, a lot of people with trauma histories, particularly complex or persistent trauma, where you have to live amongst people that might be abusive to you or live in oppressive systems, right? What do people do over time? They learn to acquiesce to the system, accommodate the system, overwork, you know, to please the system to keep themselves safe and connected. So we certainly see that, like, differentiating the fawning response versus acting like in integrity and showing up in the world with compassion and kindness and empathy for other people. There's an exercise I have in the book called the people pleasing pulse check, where you can kind of check in with yourself about
I like
when do
that.
yeah, like when do we have to also recognizing for some of us, I work with a lot of transgender folks, like sometimes people pleasing is done as a legitimate safety behavior, right? If
Mm.
like there is active retaliation that can be happening to you at work, if there's active threat to your identity, psychological or physical threat, yeah, sometimes the most compassionate thing to do is like, you know, be nice or, acquiesce to kind of to keep yourself safe. And I don't want to minimize that those realities exist. But
Yeah.
we sometimes have to do that pulse check of like, is this aligned with my values, or is this sort of like a fear-based reflexive responses that I've like learned to show up this way in relationships to be accepted, even if it's to my own detriment.
I love that. That's
Ooh, ooh.
such a good way to think about it. I also love this point about taking responsibility for others' emotions. And I think there can be this message that, like, when you're learning to be a social worker, like, that might be a way you assess that you are a good social worker, is like, oh, I can regulate people, I can help guide them through their emotions. But then you're actually, it's getting a little bit of like countertransference, or you're having issues, in that way too. So I really love that point as well. I think that's
Mhm.
well said.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And I'm curious on what did you call again the scale people pleasing
Oh,
Yeah.
people pleasing pulse check. Yeah.
people pleasing pulse check. Yeah, and I
Mhm.
I think like a people pleasing pulse check, I think I would just a question I could see asking myself too, or even, individuals who are transgender that you work with, of like, is this am I doing this because I think doing this or saying this will keep myself safe in some way? Um
Mhm.
like
Mhm.
physical safety, emotional safety, but I guess, we all have I mean, we could go down a rabbit hole of like, you know, I think it's safe,
Yeah.
but maybe it isn't a good thing for me to still do that, say that
Yeah.
thing, but
Yeah.
maybe I really think like my physical safety is in danger because I don't know, but it's just interesting.
Or even just like career safety. Like,
Right.
Mhm.
if I'm a people pleaser and I'm, retaining clients and I'm making them feel like they're connecting in sessions and I'm going above and beyond, then maybe I will keep my job and I'll, within that system. So it's an interesting,
Mhm.
Yeah. And
I
and
don't
that's
know.
why both of what you said I think is so important, because it's why I gravitate towards acceptance and commitment therapy, compassion focused therapy, that they're
Mhm.
contextually based um clinical applications, meaning like the context is everything. There's nothing that we do. I mean, I probably take that to extreme, so please, like, in the context, that is like inherently good or bad necessarily, right? I think it all has to do with the context and the workability of that behavior. So I think if we're prescriptive and we're telling people, like, you know, never take on more work, or never say, like, yes, when maybe part of you is saying no, then I think we're misguiding people. But I think what we want to do is give people the skillfulness to check in with themselves and understand the motivations behind their behaviors, and making intentional choices, not running from sort of old programming that is just like running on autopilot now, of like they're bringing it into every role, every relationship. It's just a reflex. They're going to volunteer to do the extra work. They're going to be the one that stays late. They're going to be the one to take this on. And so people can make choices, and different contexts are going to call for different actions, but we have to even be aware that we're running on autopilot, and get curious about to why that is. For most people, it makes sense. It makes sense that they've been showing up in the world the way that they have. And like you mentioned, it might be reinforced, right? I got a lot of reinforcement for my overwork. I probably got promotions for my overwork, right? So,
correct.
that is sort of like recognizing that all of the
It's
behaviors that make us susceptible to burnout are oftentimes rewarded and reinforced. So we're in this conundrum where we need flexibility. We need to sort of hold on the saying, like, it's not going to serve people to be like, stand your ground, and every time your side work say hell no, like,
No.
I mean, like that.
Yeah.
Those things come with it's a choice you may have available to you. You may not want to live with the full consequence of that choice, right?
Yeah.
But even just knowing we have choices can be incredibly empowering, because burnout is associated with a lot of feelings of stuckness and disempowerment.
Yeah. It brings up experience I had. I would say I can be a people pleaser, definitely. I feel like we all kind of have it in us anyways, but in one of my old at one of the hospitals I worked at, my manager was a social worker, and she asked me if I could work another shift, if I could pick up this shift. And I told her, and I was so proud of myself. I'm like, okay, I'm going to say no, I don't. And I had a massage scheduled that day. Like, that is stereotypically, I know, but that is something that I really love.
Yeah.
And yeah, that just restores me. And so I was like, thanks for thinking of me, but no, I have a massage scheduled that day. And her response, so my husband's a physician. At that time, he was in med school, and she was like, "Oh, doctor's wife's getting a massage."
Ew.
Wow.
I was like, "Okay," and I mean, it's like I bring that up just because, yeah, I had the the strength, and just like was like, "Okay, I'm gonna say no. I'm gonna set this boundary. I want to go to my massage," and then kind of getting this response back is hard to, kind of not have that support of like, "You know what, Taylor? I love that you said no. Take care of yourself." You know what I mean? Like, we'll find someone else. Um, so yeah, which I was like, my husband was in med school. Like, I was paying the bills, all right?
Right.
Let me just
right. Let me clear a few things up for you.
He's a
ma'am.
med student,
Right.
okay? So whatever. But I just like, it's just so important, I think, also to just like receive that validation back from people of like, when you do set that boundary, when you're not people pleasing, it's like, actually, no, this is you, and just people respecting that and
Right.
supporting you and acknowledging you, especially in your workplace. Like, my social worker was a manager.
Right. Right.
I mean, my
I-
manager was a social worker.
But I think that's sort of like so important what you're saying, though, because I think that's the reality. I think people are oftentimes finding ways to be more compassionate to themselves in systems that are not going to be compassionate back, right? So I think that a lot of the work is, how do you tolerate when you are doing something that is like perfectly, it's important for you, right? Like you're saying, like, no, this is like a way I'm advocating for myself, I'm protecting time, talking about, again, like, this is the way I'm going to do this for the next several decades, is I'm going to make sure that I protect my time for the things that feel good and are important to me and are restorative to me. And I know that setting this limit is a part of a broad, it's not just about this decision, it's about how I'm showing up in my work and how I'm going to survive as a social
Yeah.
worker, right? And it should be celebrated, right? We can kind of certainly, and for many people, it won't be. You will get judgment, you will get, you might get negative comments. And for a lot of people, that will be the deterrent. So a lot of the work is also, there's a step that I use in my blueprint called welcome the unwanted. It's like, we have to learn how to make space to be with judgment, with
Mm,
rejection,
yeah.
anxiety, all of those things that we are basing our decision to try to evade, right? Like, I'm saying yes because I don't want the judgment of being told no, and that people might think I'm lazy or not hardworking or I'm not a team player, right? Like, those are the things that we're making
Right.
decisions to evade sort of emotional or social discomfort. And a lot of the work is, yeah, taking the steps, these committed value-based action, but it's also making space for the uncomfortable internal private experiences that come alongside of sometimes doing what
Mm,
is right for ourselves.
Right, but
mm,
kind of internally knowing like, okay, within myself, I accept that I'm gonna say the thing, I'm gonna set the boundary, and it might not be accepted well, or someone might think I'm lazy or not a
mhm,
team player because I'm setting this boundary, but I know that this is important for me, but I have to be okay with however they view me or perceive me,
mhm,
which
Right.
I
mhm,
feel like is, yeah, it can be really hard because we all want to be liked and all of that.
mhm.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it hits
Right.
against that people pleasing piece of like, and that feeling of like, am I a good social worker because I said no and I didn't,
Mhm.
do what my boss told me to do, or say yes to this request. And I also think it's an interesting piece because we learn about like self care and do these things for yourself, like go get a massage, like take care of yourself. And but then there's this tension point where you're actually living that out, and it's not something that's received with your employer. And so you're like, well, I'm doing what you told me to do, and now, first of all, which I don't even think is going to necessarily work for me, like a massage would be great, but it's not going to lower my caseload. But I'm going to go ahead and do this thing anyways, which is I'm going to get a massage. Okay. And then I can't even go do that. You're like telling me that's a bad choice. So it just like
Right.
is really
Yeah.
shaming. Like it's
Right.
just like,
Mhm.
wait, how
Absolutely.
can I win?
Right.
So
Mhm.
yeah,
Right.
Yeah.
fascinating. Yeah.
So, okay, we've talked, I feel like we've really got dug deep into symptoms, kind of impacts of
Yeah.
burnout. Can you talk with us about your book talks about the acceptance and commitment therapy and the compassion focused therapy. Can you talk with us about those two?
Sure. So, acceptance and commitment therapy, which is referred to as ACT, is a third wave cognitive behavioral therapy that was developed in the 1980s to foster something called psychological flexibility. So, psychological flexibility is the ability to be with difficult emotions and experiences, and make space for them without needless defense while moving in the direction of your values. That's a sort of like the basic summation of it, what that is. And there's all sorts of processes that we support people and skills we teach people to make that possible. Um, and I paired that with compassion focused therapy because what was often a barrier for people showing up in more psychologically flexible ways in their work environment, myself included for this, was shame and high levels of self-criticism. So compassion focused therapy is a treatment approach developed by Paul Gilbert in the 2000s that is based on neurobiology, evolutionary psychology, and attachment theory that gets really curious about um, why shame and self criticism exist from an evolutionary perspective, and teaches people how to develop more compassionate relationships with themselves. And others. And I think what's critical for me, working with a lot of doctors and people that have extensive trauma histories in some cases, a lot of people really don't they don't buy into compassion when they're, especially when they're in highly competitive environments,
Mm.
forgiving environments. And I think even social workers, a lot of people that are social workers are incredibly compassionate to other people, but they kind of suck at turning it inward, right? Like they are.
Yeah.
um so this is a approach that I think really helps us understand our shame and self-criticism from a place of our evolutionary wiring, which helps, I think, a lot of people disentangle from it in a much more impactful way. And I think the combination has been really helpful. And I use that to develop sort of a 6-step framework to addressing burnout that incorporates those two therapeutic modalities as sort of as the underpinnings.
Hmm.
Mm.
Yeah, that's interesting about the compassion piece because, yeah, I think it can be seen as a weakness and, like strong leaders are just like hard and to the
Uh-huh.
point, and it's just, um, but I remember going to this training and we were talking about just like negative thoughts, negative self-talks, and how the amount of negative thoughts that we have a day, there was an estimate, I can't remember exactly, but it just was mind-blowing that it's really pervasive within a lot of us, and I think sometimes, I don't know, just those recommendations of like, say an affirmation, things like that
Mm.
can feel
Mhm.
hokey for
Yeah.
some people, or just like,
Mhm.
that's not gonna work, like,
Yeah. Yeah.
okay,
I'm
and tell
I'm one of those people.
Yeah.
It
It's
ain't gonna work for
so
me.
cringy. It
and
really
tell
is.
yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
but I think the compassion piece, and I don't know all the details. I hope, maybe we can talk a little bit about the 6 steps, but I just think like it is really important for us to be kind to ourselves. Like that is
Mhm.
huge.
Yeah.
And so yeah, maybe talk to us about the 6 steps, and I also would love to hear a little bit about more about the compassion focused therapy piece and like conversations that you have with people around that for them to be, yeah, more compassionate to themselves.
Yeah, I'll walk you through the 6 steps, and I would love to give you my elevator pitch for compassion because I do feel like
Okay.
I'm the same way. I get, like, sort of, like, those cringy feelings, and I feel like this is what has helped me and I think can help other people. So, the 6 steps, are the first one is creating a compelling vision, and we start there because, as I mentioned, that so much of folks that are burnt out are organizing their behaviors around what they don't want versus what they do want, right? So it's like they're trying to avoid rejection, humiliation, isolation, feeling anxious. So they're saying yes or no to things. They're doing things, or they're not going for the promotion they want because they don't want to be rejected. They're saying yes to things because they don't want to be seen or perceived in a certain way. And we have to start with sort of building a emotionally resonant vision of a professional life, and maybe more broadly like a life that you feel excited by.
Mm,
Motivation for is can be like a really short-lived tool, but inspiration can get people there of like what
Mm.
do you want your life to look like, be about, like what would a thriving work life be like. And the then key to that is also infusing that vision with compassion. So a lot of people will then have a vision like, I want to be doing this and that, and like and then when they're not doing it right now, or that's not available to them at this moment, it's like a yardstick. And then they criticize themselves for, not having a bigger, social media following, or not having written the book, or not opening a group practice, or, so instead of that vision being inspiring, it becomes a source of negative comparison, self criticism, and despair. So we have to do both so that that vision sort of, no matter if you're in a job that you can't leave right now because the economy is what it is, and like have other important priorities and bills to pay and your student loans to repay, that the vision is something you're living out even now, right? That like you're so connected to the values and the mission that you can see what you're doing today, how it's connected to that broader vision. I listen to a lot of business podcasts, and you'll hear these like CEOs that are like 100 millionaires talk about the best job they ever had was being a valet driver, and they'll talk about like how it helped them learn how to talk to anybody, and like that they got exposed to all these
Mm.
people with wealth through that experience. And to me, that is like living out that compelling vision. Is the vision is so ingrained, everything that you're doing now feels tied to moving in the direction of that thing that's inspiring to you. So that's one, create a compelling vision. Next is welcome the unwanted. That was that talk the what I was talking about this
Yeah.
addresses act concepts of experiential avoidance, the control agenda, and we move to things like acceptance and willingness, contact with the present moment. We're giving folks skills through mindfulness. I know, yuck, but like I do it in really, I think, creative ways that actually work for, high achieving professionals. Grounding activities, learning how to be with what's uncomfortable so we could create that life of moving towards our vision versus developing a life around the threat that we're evading, right? The next is watch your words. So watch your words is about something called enact diffusion practices. So instead of like something as simple as, instead of when we have the thought like I'm a failure, just having a different relationship with the thought where we can put a little bit emotional distance and say I'm having the thought I'm a failure, and sort of being able to create different some disconnection and see words for what they are, which are just like passing mental events, just transient sort of internal experiences. Because for most people, thought suppression doesn't work, right? And that's why slapping affirmations on everything doesn't work for most people, because those negative thoughts are deeply embedded in us. Something I say to my clients often is like, you're probably going to have to go to the grave with this, right? Like, I have self-critical thoughts every single day, and my work is learning to be with them without them controlling my behaviors or saying that those are my identity. It's learning to have them be part of my experience without it being controlled by them. So
Hmm. Mhm.
creating a different relationship with language, but I also talk about things like venting, complaining, reassurance seeking. How do we advocate for ourselves? How do we process and get support without getting into habits that keep us entrenched in our burnout? And I say that as a recovering ventaholic, that I was,
Hmm.
a small dose of venting actually increases oxytocin, is good for bonding and
Mhm.
social connection. But when it becomes excessive, it is like eroding to people's work experiences. It gets you very
Hmm.
trapped in narratives that are unhelpful. Um,
Interesting.
the
Mhm.
next is identify your unique gifts. So this is about actually being able to speak to your strengths, your contributions. A lot of us are socially conditioned not to do that. We really confuse, humility with just like pretending that we aren't good at things, like, oh, little old me, and like can't take a compliment, can't speak to our strengths. And that's a really important part of burnout recovery. Is it's not just what you're doing less of, it's like what you're doing more of the things that put you in a flow state, make you feel proud of who you are, make you feel engaged in your life and your work. That's important. Another thing is that self-criticism goes up and compassion goes down in highly competitive environments. When we are able to identify our own strengths, it helps us reduce perfectionism and increase confidence, which oftentimes makes us less toxically competitive with other people. That sort of zero sum game that if someone else is winning, it means I'm losing. And what we can then do is we can identify other people's gifts, and we can start to affirm and uplift other people in ways that makes environments more collaborative, which is collectively protective for burnout recovery. Um, the fifth one is being kind to yourself and others, which we get just like really deep into compassion work there. The yin and yang of self compassion based on the work of Kristen Neff. We talk about self care, which is like a, you know, um, a complex part of the burnout conversation, because I think we overemphasize it in many ways, but talking about foundational self-care as a way of treating yourself rather as a way of indulging yourself, and talking about the neurobiological impact of holistically approaching self-care. I could talk about it so long, so I'm going to move on from that, but that's sort of the gist. um, and the last one is letting your values take the wheel. um, and that is we will inevitably drift from our values. We cannot be intentional 100% of the day, right? And so we need skills to help us get back into ourselves when we start to regress into maybe mechanisms of survival that we know don't serve us in the long run. So, how do we compassionately recalibrate? The other thing I talk about there is compassionately prioritizing. Oftentimes, I'm a working parent. I have a lot of competing priorities. How do we actually show up when more than one thing is important to us? And maybe those things are actually coming into contrast with each other. Um, I talk about boundaries as a way to protect your values at work. They're doing a lot with like unpacking boundaries. And I even talk in that chapter of like how to quit. How do you quit in a compassionate way? We had things like the Great Resignation, where I think people thought quitting was going to be the cure to burnout. And for some people, that really was transformational. A lot of people that quit during the Great Resignation tried to get their jobs back because burnout followed them wherever they went, and that wasn't a solution to the problem. But for some people, we have to know when say like when making it work isn't workable anymore. And if you are leaving a job, doing it in a values aligned way from a place of regulation and integrity, not in a reactive way. And talking about the realities of like, will I have health care? Do I have enough savings to get me through? And how do you kind of not transition from one toxic work environment to another?
Yeah, I'm curious about the employer piece and just like ways that you've seen employers support individuals. Like, how can we advocate in our workplace? Like how do we set boundaries with our employers?
Yeah. So if you're an employer, you should be thinking about how do you safeguard people's psychological safety first, right? And I think that's from a very like human way, like don't be an asshole if you're in a position of power, right? But also
Right,
in a
like don't mock your
Lawyer
employee for trying to set a boundary because
and get
they
a
don't want to pick up
massage.
a shift. Yeah, because they want to get a
exactly.
massage.
Exactly. So in my book, I have a lot of leadership and organizational strategies specifically, but
Awesome.
psychological safety is like really important. Another thing that effective leaders do is constant review of workload, right? Um, I don't know how many people I like see in work environments where it's like somebody's doing some task or report because they've always been doing it, and when like their predecessor left, it was signed out to them, and then when you ask, nobody knows why that report is getting done, right? So you should
Mhm.
always be talking about being a leader as like it's like tending to a garden. Like you need to be like weeding and composting regularly. You need to be taking out what isn't working anymore, and you need to ensure that um, you can't say like one thing that I think often toxic leaders will do is they'll take their again that super high achieving employee and they'll say, well, Shayna's seeing 10 patients a day and can manage her 200 caseload, right? So why
Right.
can't you? You
Yeah.
need to look
Mhm,
at your
mhm.
employee with the least capacity, with the least energy, with like the most complex, and say like, what can they manage? Or at least look at like the median, like the average employee, what's a reasonable caseload for them, what's a reasonable workload for
Mhm.
them, and really have contingency plans about if somebody leaves, what are you going to do, right? Because oftentimes
Mhm.
people have no plan, and what they do is they just take the workload and disseminate it amongst the existing staff, even if like they don't know how long it's going to take to replace the people. You need to be thinking about those in a forward thinking ways, not reactively. So
Yeah.
um yeah, and boundary
Yep.
respecting culture, like what you were talking about, Taylor, like I would say that is very burnout inducing and not conducive to protecting people from burnout. So being compassionate in your leadership is really critical. And listen, we'll make mistakes. So I think
Right.
that you were owed a repair conversation, right? So it's not that we need to be
That's a good
perfect
point.
as leaders. It's just that
Mhm.
when we sort of screw up in a leadership position, it's not going to be less visible, it's going to be more visible, right? So
Mm.
we have to be modeling also how we want other people to take accountability when we're fallible and when we sort of make mistakes. I think a lot of people in leadership are afraid to say that they screwed up or they haven't been managing something well. They think that's going to make them look weak or ineffective when I think it really is the opposite.
Yeah, I would
Mm.
have welcomed that conversation, definitely.
Yeah. What do you think grad programs are missing in terms of this conversation?
Not preparing people at all for the realities of work. I think people go in and like their internship and they're given like their 3 cases or whatever it is and doing their I don't know, it's been a long time since I've been in grad school and their process recordings and, don't prepare them for the acceleration that they're oftentimes going into the very next year where their workload is
Mhm.
going to increase by 500%. I think we need to kind of teach people psychological flexibility strategies in grad school and how to
Mm.
self advocate. And those things I think are really important. I really have a pet peeve, and I'm guilty of this. So, I say it with like compassion towards myself. I hate when during interviews, people ask their prospective employees, like, "What are you doing for self care?" Right? Because I think
Me
it's so
too. I hate that too. I
right.
can totally align with you. Yes.
Right. So I think it's such coded language of like, how are you not going to make your burnout my problem? Right. And
Yes.
um, I think that in the book,
Mhm.
I give some alternatives for employers to ask that get at the heart of like wanting to understand that people have um emotional regulation strategies and have insight to know their own insight, their own limits. But I think asking questions of like, if you were experiencing burnout, how would you know and how would you be able to communicate it to me so I could support you is a very different question than, you
Mm.
know,
Mhm.
what are you doing to manage your inevitable burnout?
Right, and
Y
also it just, like, really puts the onus again on us. It's like, what are you doing to manage this
The
system, this
broken system.
workplace, this high caseload, like, and just no acknowledgement of the things that can be impacting them
Yeah.
also.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I love that advice, and I also love the perspective shift from self-care to self-advocacy, and I think grad students need to learn about self-advocacy more than self-care maybe, and
Mhm.
within self-advocacy is self-compassion, all those things, so and valuing yourself, so
Yeah.
so good.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. We'll end with I'm curious, like one piece of advice or encouragement you'd have to give someone who's realizing maybe they're starting to, maybe they're listening to this episode like, oh, maybe,
Oh boy.
oh, we're in the thick of it. Like, what are some things that we can be thinking about while we're going through our work, and be mindful of, and then what do we do about it? That's a
Yeah.
loaded question, but
No, I got you. I got you. I've been thinking about this a lot. Um, so when we're burnt out, we rely a lot on control strategies. Like, and that we are either whether it's overwork, whether it's, locking ourselves in our rooms, ignoring our notes and like watching, 5 hours of Love Island or whatever. These are all ways to try to get rid
whoops.
of, right? Or
Guilty, for sure.
or escape our distress and internal, private experience. It was just totally understand. So a lot of what I do is talking about choice over control, right? There's so much here that we
Mhm.
don't have control over that we have to sort of kind of just acknowledge like it's not we cannot um immediately change all of these things. But what is almost always available to us, with very rare exception, is that we almost always have choice. Now, choice doesn't mean unlimited choices, right? But in any given moment, right now, as you're listening to this podcast, you have a choice in what you focus on. And that could be like internally in your body, what you're focusing on around you, what you consciously decide to think about in any given moment. Um, the meaning that you make of things. So, not your automatic thoughts, not your like negative evaluations that come out without, conscious thought, but what you decide, right, that an experience is going to mean for you. Is it going to mean you're a failure? Is it going to mean that, you know, you're going to keep trying? Or is it going to mean that there was an important lesson that you got out of this experience or it taught you something about yourself that you get to assign the meaning to any given experience? There's so few things that are objective truths, which means we get to narrate our lives in many ways. And then the behavior, and whenever you can muster it, and you can choose intentionally, can you make the most compassionate behavior that's available to you in the moment? So I always come back to that anytime I'm overwhelmed, stressed, pissed off. What can I focus on right now? What is the meaning what do I want to make this mean? And what can I do? Or sometimes when you're burnt out, what can I not do? What do I need to just do? I need to just like take a beat and not do anything right now and just kind of like sit this one out. And I just come back to that over and over and over.
Yeah. I love that. Thank you. This was a very refreshing conversation. I think
I
just a
agree.
unique, yeah, I
Mhm.
think just a conversation that I haven't had before about this topic. So really appreciate
Mhm.
you and the work that you're doing. I think a lot of us social workers, this is what I think. I mean, Faith and I, we want this. We're thinking that
Yeah.
everyone is, yeah, excited about this and just appreciate the work that you've done.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Yeah. I agree with Taylor. It's so refreshing to hear this perspective and like I really appreciate what you're doing. I think a lot of times the conversation is not productive sometimes and actually makes people feel worse and more shame and like I need to be doing more to, mitigate and put up with a job that is really really difficult. And so I really appreciate you and what you're doing. I think it's super good. Yeah.
yeah.
Thank you so
Awesome.
much, so much. And
Yeah.
honestly, like I think you two are such an incredible example of like in a professional space how you can live out your values. Like you have a mission of something that's important to you and like you're putting it out in this accessible way that's also interesting and engaging and like a fun listen. So so respect what you both are doing and I love the
Mhm.
podcast. So honored to be on.
Thanks. Thanks so much. Well, that's it, guys. Thanks so much for listening. We'll put, Shayna's links in the show notes if you want to reach out to her, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.